Hi, everyone. Great to see everybody, and welcome to our first departmental seminar of this academic year. It gives me a really great pleasure to start this academic year with such an important discussion on race, racism, and politics of identity, and especially at this extremely unique and strange moment of world history. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the organizers, Lerner and especially Alberto, for really putting together such distinguished group of scholars to discuss these issues. I'll just say that I completely agree with the words on the poster that you've published for this panel. The COVID pandemic did not erase, but actually highlighted the need to discuss politics of racism and identity. And if you know, in our kind of little circle, we can say that if there's one positive outcome to the current misery, is that the pandemic proved, I think, to all skeptics that politics in general and identity politics especially may affect people's life and death, no less or as much as medicine and science. And last week we opened the semester here at Tel Aviv University, and I have to admit on a personal level that it was the saddest opening week I've ever experienced in all my years of teaching. And although we'd like to, think of ourselves as the ivory tower, I think that the Zoom made me, and maybe us, realize that social distancing is really not fun at all. And this week of kind of teaching again through Zoom made me wonder to what extent is social distancing experience that I think we share around the world. I mean, hundreds of maybe and millions of people around the world share this experience of being sort of away from each other, how it would affect our thinking about race and about identity politics. Maybe, I mean, although I tend to be pessimistic usually, but I think I'm not completely ready to dismiss the possibility that the pandemic can actually have or may be seen as an opportunity to rethink our social priorities, and might even be an opportunity to enhance democratic public participation in a way that would reshape the political agenda and eventually even restructure legal policies. And I think a wonderful example is the protest against racism that we see in the US and around the world, which in a way represents a response to the social vulnerabilities that were made manifest by the pandemic. So I hope maybe we'll see other examples, maybe some of the discussion that the important discussion that we see in the US will spill over and sort of influence other countries and Israel as well. So I mean, I have a lot to say, but maybe later in the discussion, maybe we'll with this sort of tiny glimpse of optimism, I'll just say thank you very much for allowing me for inviting me to say a few words, and I wish everyone the best, the most fruitful, healthy, and enjoyable academic year as much as possible. And congratulations again for this great panel. Thank you.
Okay, I am really happy to participate on the panel, and I just want to second Hanna's thanks to our speakers who are joining us from far and somewhat nearer, and also, of course, to thank Alberto for all of his work in planning the panel. So I am going to chair the panel, and that means that I will first briefly introduce our speakers. Then each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. I will respond to their presentations in an attempt to put their papers in dialogue and begin the conversation, and then we'll open the floor to questions from you, the audience. Our first speaker will be Roger Smith, who is a professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania and a past president of the American Political Science Association. He works on constitutional law, American political thought, modern legal and political theory with special interest in questions of citizenship, race, ethnicity, and gender. His most recent book is called Political Peoplehood, The Roles of Values, Interests, and Identities, which was published by University of Chicago in 2015. And if I understand correctly, his paper today is co-authored with Desmond King. And so it might be worth noting that he has also co-authored a book with Desmond King called Still a House Divided, Race and Politics in Obama's America. Our second speaker is Alan Patten, who is a professor of politics and the chair of the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He has written extensively on multiculturalism and theories of justice. His most recent book, which was published in 2014 by Princeton University Press, is called Equal Recognition, The Moral Foundations of Minority Rights. And he's currently working on a new book called A Liberal Theory of Religious Freedom. His paper today is co-authored with Shuk Chan, who is with us, who is, according to the note I was given, which I assume was written by Alan. And so I will give you the honor of hearing what your professor wrote about you, that you are one of his most brilliant PhD students. Our third speaker will be Yuli Tamir, who has just begun a position as the president of Beit Berl, which is a multidisciplinary college near Kfar Saba here in Israel. And she was previously the president of Shankar College. And she has also served as both the Minister of Education here in Israel and also the Minister of Immigration. And her books include Liberal Nationalism from 1993, and her most recent book, Why Nationalism, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2019. And our final speaker and the impresario behind this panel is Alberto Spektorowski, who, as many of you know, is a professor of political science here at Tel Aviv, much to our sorrow, recently retired, although we wish you well and are excited that you're still hanging out in the hallways here. He works on issues related to the radical right and the politics of eugenics. And he has several forthcoming books, including the one that I think is most relevant to the discussion of the panel today is The Challenge of Islam in Europe and the Resurgence of Nationalism from Multiculturalism to Democratic Discrimination, which is coming out with Michigan University Press. And his future work will address the challenge of fascist political thought to liberal hegemony. So having introduced our speakers, I will now hand the floor over to Roger Smith, who will be our first speaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks to everybody who helped organize, everybody who's joined. I hope I'm permitted to mention that actually my most recent book came out this past summer. It's called That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Peoplehood, and from the Yael Press. And I clearly haven't done a great job of publicizing it. I may draw on it in my broader discussion. But what I'm presenting is a paper written with Desmond King of Oxford that focuses on recent changes in American racial politics that may well further heighten the already severe political polarization in America, regardless of the outcome of this election. And for this international audience, I should note that the developments I'll discuss have counterparts in identity politics movements around the world. It's a familiar story that American politics has become more polarized over the last 40 years, with the ideological distance between elected Republican and elected Democratic leaders increasing sharply. And it's well known that this polarization has been intertwined with increasingly racially polarized voting, with the Republican Party winning the majority of white voters, usually around 60%, and the Democrats winning supermajorities amongst non-white voters, ranging from around 2/3 of Latinos to well over 90% of African Americans. Though Democrats have won the popular vote in 6 of the last 7 presidential elections, no Democratic presidential candidate has carried the white vote since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. And with the exception of Latinos, racially polarized voting has heightened since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. For the last 15 years, King and I have argued that racially polarized voting, and to a significant degree partisan polarization, have been intertwined with and partly driven by a deep divide over racial policy issues. We've argued that, in fact, the structure of American national racial politics has been built from the nation's inception in part by competition between what we call racial policy alliances or racial institutional orders. These synonymous terms refer to broad political coalitions joined by their stances on the major racial policy issues defining their eras. We sometimes call the coalitions alliances to stress their character as loose networks, groups and actors pushing in the same policy direction. Sometimes we call them institutional orders to stress that the alliances include governing institutions and officials who authoritatively shape people's lives in line with their racial visions. Until recently, American politics displayed three sets of racial orders and alliances. Initially, a pro-slavery and anti-slavery alliance up to the Civil War. After the Civil War, a pro-segregation, anti-segregation alliance that shaped politics to the 1960s. And from the late 1970s to now, racial conservatives who formerly supported segregation rebranded themselves as adherents of a colorblind approach to any federal reforms tackling racial inequality. And they stood in opposition to race-conscious measures that were becoming central to the agendas of many civil rights activists. Although many of those activists had championed colorblindness in opposition to racial segregation, most soon concluded, as some had long insisted, that real progress for people of color required substantial race-targeted initiatives. And although this may have been realistic as policy, as politics, it shifted the advantage back to racial conservatives who were willing to modify their views, at least publicly, and favor colorblind commitments, which appear race neutral, and especially in a nation with America's traditions of individualism, it sounds fair for no person to gain advantages or penalties because of their race. But because America also has strong traditions of white supremacy that have fostered deeply entrenched inequalities, insisting on colorblindness has meant in practice the maintenance of many disadvantages of the nation's people of color. As a result, since the 1960s, racial conservatives have recognized that they can both defend their interests and regain the high ground in the popular mind by professing principled dedication to colorblindness. Now, they've never entirely prevailed. Proponents of colorblindness and race-conscious measures have controlled various contesting American federal, state, and local governing agencies over the last half century. But since the Reagan Revolution of 1980, the Colorblind Racial Policy Alliance has had the upper hand. Today's circumstances are changing. America is witnessing a fundamental transition in the structure of its racial politics. The US has embarked on a political period defined by a still more polarized opposition between racial conservatives rallied to white protectionism, explicitly mobilized to preserve or enhance existing white advantages, and racial reformers acting to end systemic racism through racial reparations that aim to go far beyond now traditional but limited affirmative action programs. Whatever the results of the 2020 election, these new racial policy alliances may long endure and structure American politics. So what do we mean by white protectionism? It's the view that whites have come to be the frequent victims, perhaps the leading victims of discrimination in America by both public and private institutions and actors. A 2011 study found that while both Black and white Americans believed anti-Black bias had declined from the 1950s through the 2000s, many whites thought anti-white bias had been rising through those decades, eventually becoming more extensive in their eyes than anti-Black bias. By 2017, 55% of whites believe that whites suffer discrimination in modern America, though they acknowledge racial minorities experience discrimination as well. And those who viewed whites as discriminated against opposed not only explicitly race-conscious policies, but also facially race-neutral policies that they saw as really aimed chiefly at aiding non-whites, thereby victimizing whites in their eyes. This rising white ethnic identity politics helped fuel the Trump movement's success in 2016. Popular receptivity to three elements of the Trump campaign shifted colorblind commitments toward white protectionism. First was a more militant rhetoric that eschewed mention of colorblind principles and spoke often of protection. Second, a new strategic emphasis on especially the victimization of white Christians. And third, a ruthless pursuit of civil rights policy reversals. I won't go through the evidence for all these, but let me note from the time he entered politics, Trump has attacked what he called those peddling the narrative of cops as a racist force in our society. He has frequently tweeted accounts of especially white victims of crimes perpetrated by Blacks, twice retweeting from a Twitter user called White Genocide TM. And though the official message has been that Trump will protect all Americans at criminal violence, many have heard something different. Counties that hosted Trump rallies in 2016, excuse me, those counties saw a 226% increase in racial and religious hate crimes in ensuing years. And I should note that many of the white nationalist groups that have been inspired by Trump see themselves part of an international surge of ethno-nationalism with allies in other countries. During the 2020 campaign, as Trump's ratings have fallen with the COVID crisis, he's responded by ratcheting up his protectionist rhetoric, promising not so much public health, but instead safety against Black Lives Matter protesters and policies that might promote suburban race and class integration. Over the July 4th weekend, Trump promised to defeat what he termed a new far-left fascism that sought to destroy our national heritage, like statues of his hero, Andrew Jackson. He called painting Black Lives Matter in New York City a symbol of hate. He attacked Obama-era efforts to promote low-income, racially integrated housing in American suburbs, contending he was protecting the American dream. He threatened to veto plans to change or remove the names of Confederate generals from military bases, plans that even most Republicans supported. He's refused to criticize self-proclaimed militia members who show up armed at Black Lives Matter protests and use the resulting confrontations to justify shooting demonstrators. But even for Trump, it is politically unwise to speak too explicitly of white protectionism, much less white supremacy. He has learned that he can gain ardent support by promising explicitly to protect Christians against unjust liberal abuses. And he makes this promise primarily to conservative white Christians. In 2016, he assured a rally of white Christians that in his administration, Christianity will have power. In his nomination acceptance speech, he criticized the 1954 Johnson Amendment depriving religious institutions of their tax-exempt status if they endorsed candidates, saying their voice has been taken away. He went on to tell Christian groups, Christian faith is not the past, but the present and the future of America, that our media culture often mocks and demeans people of faith, and our politicians have really abandoned you, but that under him, Christian heritage will be cherished, protected, defended like you've never seen before. By 2020, most of America's white Christian conservatives believed Trump had fulfilled these promises beyond their expectations. Interviewed in the New York Times, one Trump supporter contended that it had been dangerous to be Christian under Obama because all of the problems were blamed on, quote, the white believers. Another contended that in the Obama years, our freedoms were slowly being taken away and that Caucasian Americans were becoming a minority. And so it was clear to them when Trump promised to protect Christianity, he was also promising to protect American whites. Trump's policies have done so. I can't go through the whole roster of them, but they include stripping the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Office of Fair Lending and Equal Opportunity from enforcement powers against discrimination in credit lending, ending the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission's rules requiring companies to report pay by sex, race, and ethnicity to identify discriminatory patterns, attacking affirmative action initiatives, refusing to combat the rise of right-wing extremist groups, and much more. In the interest of the time, though, let me move now to the rise of new position aiming to combat systemic racism and often speaking of racial reparations. Just as white protectionism represented a new emphasis of long present themes amongst racial conservatives, This new left activism elevates to greater prominent positions long held by advocates for people of color. In 1989, US Representative John Conyers began repeatedly introducing a bill to create a commission to study and develop reparations. In the most recent primary process, most Democratic presidential candidates endorsed this bill, including, after a history of skepticism, eventual nominee Joe Biden. Nonetheless, reparations calls have remained at the margin of racial politics until recently, but the writings of Ta-Nehisi Coates and also especially the rise of the Black Lives Movement and the receptivity to its demonstrations this summer that Hanna referred to, this has helped move reparations more to the center of the agenda. Most Americans still oppose them. But Black Lives Matter is a partner with roughly 50 other groups under an umbrella organization, the Movement for Black Lives, that endorsed reparations in its 2016 platform and defined them expansively, not as payments to individuals, but rather commitments to restructuring the economy and healthcare, housing, and education to strengthen Black communities. These broad programs are now what people are calling reparations, and they're beginning to get some purchase. On July 14th, 2020, the City Council of Asheville, North Carolina, a southern city that's 83% white, voted unanimously to apologize for the city's past complicity in slavery and created a community reparations commission tasked to recommend funding to increase minority home ownership and aid minority businesses. Asheville followed the lead of Evanston, Illinois, which decided in 2019 to adopt a new tax to fund housing and employment opportunities for its African-American residents. Providence, Rhode Island, and Richmond, Virginia, among other cities, are considering similar measures. And institutions of higher education like Georgetown University and the Princeton Theological Seminary have sought to aid those victimized by those institutions' past complicity in slavery. Catholic nuns in Louisiana are doing the same, and many of the progressive candidates that did well in 2020, like New York's Jamal Bowman, have endorsed reparations. Economist William Darity therefore calls the surge in political receptivity to reparations a sea change, although he thinks that much more is still needed. These changed circumstances mean that those who present themselves as liberals, progressives in American politics are likely to feel in the years ahead increased pressure to advance a civil rights demanding civil rights agenda aimed at systemic racism that many will label racial reparations. On its face, the shift of the dominant positions in American racial policy debates toward racial reparations and white protectionism, though far from complete, represents a disturbing deepening of longstanding and profound American racial divides. Because of the prominent role Donald Trump has played in these developments, there's a chance that its heightening will not endure after he departs the White House, whenever he does so. Many analysts believe, however, that the post-Trump GOP will be led by successors who will claim his mantle, and there are many potential candidates to do so. Though most might not promise white protectionism as crudely as Trump has done, all are likely to present the agenda of racial reparations to end systemic racism as radical and dangerous as far-left fascism. Many Democrats, moreover, may seek in practice to combine efforts to combat systemic racism to something closer to the moderate civil rights agenda they've pursued since the 1970s. It is nonetheless true, I believe, that most Democratic candidates and most Americans who see themselves as at least moderately liberal, especially on racial issues, will continue to be sympathetic to Black Lives Matter and look for forms of what might be called reparations that they can support. If they succeed in finding policies that have broad appeal, then the next era of American racial politics, unlike the current one, may be one in which the policy alliance that is proposing transformative egalitarian reforms gains predominance. And for me, that's the hope.
Great, thanks so much. Now, Alan and Shuk.
Hi, everybody. Hope you can hear me. First of all, I want to thank the Tel Aviv Political Science Department and especially Alberto for hosting this event. It's disappointing not to be able to enjoy the Tel Aviv hospitality in person, since I know how wonderful that is. But it's great to at least be able to connect in this in this way. As Julie said, my co-author, who goes by the name Ying, is with us, and she's going to present the second half of this presentation. I'll present the first half. It's more of a sneak preview of a paper in progress than a polished, completed paper, but we're glad to have a chance to share our thoughts with you. And then finally, we put the handout for the talk in the chat function. It's not essential to follow the handout, but some of the quotes that we use can be found there. We've been thinking about the politics of race and racism by exploring a rather specific phenomenon, that of unequal cultural exchange between developed and developing countries. This inequality is a well-documented phenomenon. According to a 2013 UNESCO report, the Arab states, the Pacific, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Caribbean together accounted for less than 1% of the total global export of cultural goods, while North America and Europe made up 49%. Now, some liberals may not think that these patterns of unequal cultural exchange imply a serious wrong. They point out that unequal cultural flows arise because of a desirable global division of labor that reflects in part the advantages that accrue when artists and creative people live and work in close proximity to one another in a relatively small number of global centers of cultural production. They may also note that unequal flows are mediated to a considerable degree by the preferences of consumers. Netflix does not impose itself on developing world societies using gunboats, but rather through the viewing choices of its viewers. Many liberals may also suspect that branding unequal cultural exchange as wrong will serve to justify policies of cultural protectionism that invariably are essentialist and a threat to personal autonomy. While taking seriously these points, our claim is that there is a serious wrong associated with what we call neo-colonial cultural exchange, the patterns of unequal cultural exchange that are typical of relationships between developed and developing world states in the contemporary world. Our main argument is that unequal cultural exchange disrupts efforts to establish equal recognition and thus social equality. By focusing on this specific issue, we hope to outline a new way that liberals who are committed to social equality should think about issues of cultural exchange and protection. So our argument is grounded in an ideal of social equality that calls upon global institutions to establish and maintain egalitarian social relations. When it's foreseeable that people will live and interact with one another, a crucial imperative is to ensure that they do so on egalitarian terms, so that their lives are not structured by domination and subordination and by distinctions between social superiors and inferiors. Social equality has implications for the power relations that obtain in a community and the distribution of material goods and opportunities. But at its heart, social equality is a matter of the attitudes that people have towards one another. To live as social equals is to recognize others as equals and to share a commitment to building a social world together that reflects such a recognition. Importantly, social equality is not inherently connected to the state, and in our view, can conceivably extend across borders for at least two reasons. First, in today's highly diverse societies, it's difficult to imagine how individuals could maintain a set of egalitarian attitudes and dispositions internally, while simultaneously regarding members of outsider groups as inferior or unworthy of concern and respect. If the society is diverse enough, then a despised outsider group will also be found on the inside. Second, cross-border inegalitarian dispositions undermine efforts to achieve even the most minimal forms of global justice. If individuals come to view foreigners as inferiors, undeserving of equal moral status, it becomes easier to accept and rationalize structures of oppression, marginalization, and exploitation. So unless one rejects global justice in all its forms, one should care about egalitarian relations with foreigners. So for someone committed to this ideal of social equality, a central question is, what conditions help to realize and sustain inclusive egalitarian relationships, not only between individuals sharing a society, but across borders as well? We see this as a problem of recognition. Social equality involves recognition, both because it's constituted by reciprocal attitudes and dispositions of consideration and respect, and because it continuously raises the question of who is to be included in the circle of people who will enjoy the benefits of and themselves be bound by these attitudes and dispositions. In thinking about this problem, a first step is to appreciate that failures of recognition are typically connected with the use of ascriptive social categories to characterize individuals, such as race, gender, sexuality, and so on. Stereotypes are often associated with these social identities. When a social identity group is stereotypically seen as lacking important qualities and capacities, individuals identified with the group are regarded as unfit for a relationship of social equality. So our argument focuses on a specific strategy for combating stereotypes that stand in the way of recognition. Those who traffic in stereotypes frequently offer what they take to be evidence for their generalizations. If pressed, they point to the observable actions, practices, and achievements of the identity group in question and insist that they see little evidence of the traits and qualities that are needed for recognition as equals. In the case of colonialism, for example, colonizers point to various indicators of progress and civilization that the colonized society is supposed to lack. Features of their economic practices, political institutions, forms of religion, family structures, cultural achievements, and so on. Moreover, stereotypes do not have to be consciously held. They often consist of implicit biases and associations that even individuals who consciously subscribe to the ideal of social equality may nonetheless act upon. Groups get associated with certain traits and characteristics, and this association implicitly rationalizes withholding recognition from members of the group. One way to counter these preconceptions is to empower individuals to engage in forms of action which demonstrate that they do in fact have the relevant agential qualities that make them moral equals. The use of violence to overthrow the colonial regime is sometimes characterized in this light in anti-colonial thought inspired by the Hegelian tradition. Through risking their lives in violent struggle, the colonized show off their independence from their given existence. They demonstrate their courage and their freedom. But there are other ways in which individuals and groups can demonstrate to one another that they possess the traits and capacities associated with human agency that are more suitable to a democratic society and a peaceful world order. Economic production, political action, religious worship, and artistic creation are all modes of human activity that can generate tangible evidence of agential capacities and that can therefore function to mediate the recognition of others. So I'm going to pass things over to Ying now.
Great, thanks, Alan. So our argument focuses on one mode of human activity that historically has been particularly crucial for recognition or non-recognition of groups as social equals. We're thinking of the role of cultural production in these dynamics of recognition. Historically, colonizers often justified the colonial project on the grounds that a lack of European culture demonstrated the inferiority of the colonized group. Consider, for example, Thomas Macaulay's notorious 1835 Minute on Indian Education, which formed the basis of education policy in British India for half a century. Macaulay wrote that, quote, a single shelf of good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia, quote, end quote, and that it was, quote, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools in England, end quote. This attitude of cultural superiority underlay the political, economic, and racial hierarchies that define colonial rule. So for this reason, anti-colonial thinkers often thought that cultural production was an especially important site in the struggle for recognition. Aimé Césaire, for example, argued in the 1950s that cultural production, quote, restores historic initiative to those whom it has been the mission of the colonial system to deprive, and thereby disturbs the colonial hierarchy as it converts the colonized consumer into creator, end quote. As Césaire saw it, when members of the colonized population show that they can also produce culture, this undermines the colonizers' lie that colonial subjects are inferior agents and therefore should be put under European tutelage. We would highlight two reasons why the production of cultural goods has been a particularly critical indicator of agency, and therefore an important mediator of recognition. First, typical artifacts of culture, like art, music, literature, film, and so on, are paradigmatic expressions of agency. Their production involves intelligence, creativity, powers of observation, and also hard work, self-discipline, long hours of practice, mastery of skills. So in this sense, cultural goods are tangible evidence that their creators have these sorts of traits and qualities. Second, cultural goods are not just evidence of individual creative powers. The individual powers and capacities are fostered by a supportive cultural environment, and the cultural goods themselves respond to the context in which they are created. Cultural production shows off the richness of the formative context that generates it, therefore providing indirect evidence of the capacities of all who are shaped by that context, even if they're not personally involved in creating cultural goods. So what's wrong with neo-colonial patterns of cultural exchange in which the developed world today predominantly still exports to the developing world while importing relatively little in return? In a nutshell, our argument is that these patterns of cultural exchange reinforce the denial of recognition of non-white and historically underprivileged peoples as equals, and therefore undermines the goal of attaining global relations of social equality. Because they import very little, dominant groups in the developed world are not presented with what they regard as evidence of cultural achievement by the peoples of the formerly colonized world. And therefore, they do not perceive a basis for revising stereotypes of those peoples as social inferiors. And because they export very little, underprivileged peoples lack the opportunity to contest this hierarchical outlook that prevails in the privileged parts of the world. Instead, the developing world imports a demeaning representation of its own capacities and status. And the developed world, when it does import cultural goods from the developing world, expects those goods to conform to certain stereotypes and expectations that reinforce unequal recognition. Given the dynamics of recognition, there's no simple solution to these challenges. As the master learns in Hegel's dialectic of recognition, forcing someone to recognize another is self-defeating. Whatever recognition is offered up in this way will be responsive to the threat of force rather than to the inherently admirable qualities of the recipient of recognition. Compelling people in the developed world to consume more developing world culture or censoring what kinds of developing world cultural products they can access would fail to bring about social equality. The aim is recognition based on the free appreciation of the qualities and achievements of peoples who have historically been represented as inferior. The problem of unequal cultural flows, then, must be addressed by focusing on the ways in which global structures can limit the opportunities of formerly colonized peoples to express and demonstrate their agency. So with this in mind, we see two broad policy implications in our analysis. The first is that global free trade in cultural goods is a problematic ideal. Although many liberals and cosmopolitans celebrate the worldwide free exchange of culture, our argument highlights the dangers of the free trade paradigm. Under free trade, the gains associated with having only a small number of centers of cultural production together with existing consumer preferences, can lead to dramatically unequal patterns of exchange that jeopardize the recognition that is essential to social equality. In our view, all else being equal, well-off countries should not press for trade concessions in this sector, and instead should contribute to assisting with cultural production in underprivileged states. This can be done, for example, through providing financial assistance and technology transfers, and crucially, through prioritizing the import and distribution of cultural goods from underprivileged societies, so as to make these cultural goods more visible and accessible to their own citizens. Underprivileged states, on the other hand, should resist demands for free trade in cultural goods and instead consider policies of cultural protectionism, such as direct and indirect subsidies to local cultural producers. The second policy implication concerns the treatment of intellectual and cultural appropriation in international law. We advocate for tough restrictions on cultural appropriation to ensure that formerly colonized peoples receive appropriate credit for their expressions and demonstrations of cultural agency. When an already privileged group is given credit for culture that a historically underprivileged group produced, this contributes to the continued marginalization of the latter as value-producing agents to whom equal recognition is owed. To sum up, then, our argument is that patterns of cultural exchange play an important role in creating and preserving the relationships of equal recognition that are partly constitutive of social equality. The onus is on dominant groups to support structural changes that contribute to cultivating and maintaining social equality. Indeed, against the odds and even in extreme situations such as formal colonialism, members of marginalized groups have continued to find ways to express their agency through unsanctioned forms of political action, knowledge, and cultural production. Our point is that existing structures should be reformed so as to make these demonstrations of subaltern agency more visible and therefore better able to function as mediators of recognition. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yuli, you are next in line.
Yep. Hi, good. Here it's afternoon, so good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for organizing this panel. I would like to, I hope you will allow me to be a little bit more optimistic than the previous speakers, and try to argue that what we've seen now, especially in the post-corona era, is re-emergence of political understanding that have been, I think, undermined by globalism and neoliberalism. And we are entering a situation where there could be, it's not a necessity, but it could happen, that there could be a convergence of ideas coming from left and right, breaking the traditional ideological camps. And though we now feel that we are in the middle of real political sort of polarization, at least in some countries around the world, we see a process of convergence. We see a process where right, left, center, and Greens, and I think the Green Party in Europe plays an enormously important part in that process, come together in a very surprising, but very, I would say, very instrumental way to create new kinds of coalition. So while I think we are feeling, both in the United States and certainly in Israel, a growing polarization, this need not be the case, because I think the conditions that have been created before the corona, but are emphasized by the corona, are creating maybe a beginning of a new political process that we have been seeing a little bit of it before the emergence of the corona, but we will probably see more later on. So let me just make 3 points that hopefully would support my argument. I think the most interesting thing for me looking at the coronavirus and political reality is that the fact that the corona is a global pandemic didn't undermine the desire of states to act on a national basis. Actually, the greatest support for the nation state recently has been responses to the coronavirus. It started with the states closing up their borders. And think about Europe for a moment. In Europe, people didn't think about economic exchanges, proximity, where would the virus travel. They automatically closed their national borders. Schengen was, overruled in a moment. Nobody asked the European Union whether to close their border. The instinct was there is a crisis and we respond nationally. So even Germany and France that hesitated to begin with whether to act this way, followed the crowd. And we saw a very state-centered national response to the corona. It's rather irrational to think that the threat comes from across the border, but that's what people do. They, even now, don't allow people to travel from one state to another. Even red states are reluctant to allow foreigners in. The idea is that we, the state, close ourselves, protect our citizens, by the way, doing very little distinction between immigrants or newcomers or veterans. We close the system, we protect our system, and we are measured, by the way. It's all these national graphs. How are things in Germany? How are things in Italy? How are things? You see the graph. I always see it from the field of education. You rank nations according to their performance. Suddenly they stick together because if they perform well or they perform less well, they are considered as one unit. The second thing that happened is that states all around the world, irrespective of their ideology, became very active players. And they did something which was like a year ago, totally inconceivable, right? They have, put behind the idea that an economy or a solid economy is measured by its debt, what is the proportion within state income and state expenses, and just poured money all around, some wisely and some less wisely, but states became active players, and they were all clear about the fact that they owe their citizens support, financial support. By the way, not like 2008, it didn't go to the banks, it went to the people. We owe support to the people. And we have to save the jobs, we have to save the economy, we have to create a system that is working again. And the system was a national one. I think one of the most visual aspects of that is that every bureaucrat now talking, or every doctor talking about the pandemic, has a flag behind his or her back. It's all sort of national messages. Maybe the clearest one, and maybe also the most beautifully phrased one, was the Queen speaking to the English people. Her son was diagnosed with corona. Her prime minister was hospitalized with corona, and she talked to the British people about the greatness of the stiffer upper lip. We can survive it because we are the kind of people we are. So suddenly, in a very, very strange way, the nationalist discourse came back, both in terms of borders, then in terms of economy, and into this dialogue came all the things that were totally excluded until recently: protectionism, bring our jobs back. Even Joe Biden now runs around with a sign, "Buy American." Globalism has been sort of overturned for taking care of the people here, finding them jobs and making a future for them. So this, I think, is an indication that we are, when we are under stress, we go back to some very basic notions of what the state should do for us. And interestingly enough, the convergence that I don't have a lot of time to spell out is built on 3 legs. And can I share my screen, Alberto?
Yeah, I think that's grown in. Yeah.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
so
you
let's see
could.
if
You should be able to do that.
Okay, so let's see if I can find it. Okay, so this is also part of a future paper, but what I'm trying to claim is the following. The pandemic highlighted the fact that we were moving into a democracy, and I think Rodgers spoke about it a lot, that takes into account the position of the stakeholders, not the shareholders. You know, this is a discourse coming a little bit from the economic sphere, but people now in the economic sphere are talking of a shift between shareholder to stakeholder democracies. And defining the stakeholders became a big issue. Who is in and who is out? This is related both to immigration and integration policy. It's also related to those people who feel left behind because of all sorts of reasons. They all say, this is my democracy, I want it to protect me. It overlaps with an idea of the state being a player in the well-being of its citizens. And it puts together the desire to protect the interest of the present stakeholders, citizens, but also future stakeholders, which I think are both, you know, the younger generation, the future generation, allowing them to be protected and maybe providing them more opportunities, something that most economies now don't offer very generously. And this overlaps with a view of the future well-being, overlaps with an idea of protecting the environment. And I don't know, I don't follow the American election, I should say, so closely, but I think environment, you know, is playing a major role in Joe Biden's new Green New Deal. The well-being, the economic protectionism. We heard Ellen speak about cultural protectionism. I think more and more countries are talking about the way we protect this generation and future generation, and cultural protectionism is certainly concerned with mostly, or not mostly, but with the present and the future generation in order to create this kind of overlap. Now, I just want to end by remarking that this is already happening in places like, well, most of the Nordic countries have created these kind of, people said, strength coalitions of center green, center right coalition. If you look for, I think the clearest example is Mette Frederiksen in Denmark, moving to the right on immigration, she was always on the left on the welfare state, taking a very clear stand on welfareism. You can see it in New Zealand, in Australia. You can see it in an interesting way in Austria, even in the UK, where people are breaking the right and left spheres in order to create some sort of an overlapping. I think, for example, you know, when Boris Johnson, I'm not a fan of Boris Johnson, I should say, but when Boris Johnson took over in his first speech, he turned to Jeremy Corbyn, which I'm not a fan of also, and said, I'm going to steal your agenda. I'm going to talk on protecting the working people better than you can, you know, better than you. And then the second statement he made was about the environment, which was interesting for me to see because it neither was on the platform of the sort of more conservative party in the UK before the election. So I want to say that maybe the present crisis pushes the political scene to seek a new language, and that this new language will have more in common than we may assume right now. We now see the polarization, the counter-polarization forces are now, I think, entering the political game, and more and more places are talking about how we should bridge the gap, paying compensation, protecting, the weak members of society. So the dialogue that was was seen as a sort of extreme left and extreme right dialogue is merging into a more, I think, centrist understanding of how politics should work. So maybe I'm a bit too optimistic, but I think there are quite a lot of indication that there is going to be a new kind of political discourse. We're all caught with, you're caught with Trump, we're caught with Bibi, we think this is it, it's going to be like this forever. I think we should look a little bit behind the corner, and maybe we'll see something new emerging. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much. And finally, Alberto.
Well, thank you very much, Julie. This is kind of a work in progress about populism and identity. And let me start by saying that for not few optimists, a possible victory of John Biden in the electoral context might symbolize, we should think, in the beginning of the end of the backlash, of populist backlash in Western societies. Nowadays, especially during times of COVID-19, the idea is that anti-democratic movements which reject science and expertise will finally pay the price of their own inconsistencies. In this paper, however, I don't want to dismiss the faith that populism is a momentary backlash against liberal modernity. Yet my argument is that the moment could be a long one for two complementary reasons. First of all, populism has a strong social basis, the product of deep cleavages that have emerged in Western society that maybe pay the price of their own economic and political success. The second is that populism nowadays fits perfectly well as a challenge, but also as an integral part of well-established democracies. In this sense, populism differs from fascism, which presented both an ideological and an aesthetic alternative to democracy. Fascism presented the idea of a new heroic man and of a totalitarian revolutionary state as against liberalism and democratic sovereignty. Populism also differs from communism, which presented a total alternative to formal democracy by idealizing a classless society. Needless to add that both communism and fascism had been defeated by liberalism, one in the battlefield and the other in the economic and political realm. Despite populism's all distortions of democratic rules, I believe, and again, probably wishful thinking, populist parties in power will be finally ousted by robust majorities. And I put the accent, robust majorities. Populism, however, even when not in power, places liberalism or anti-populists in a very complicated situation because it is directly embedded in democracy. Hardly wants to destroy democracy because the latter works in its favor and precisely uses democracy in order to dismantle the liberal pluralist part of the formula. What modern populists in modern societies have done thus is indirectly and maybe unwittingly leading to a redefinition of the democratic debate in what nowadays is recognized as a conceptual rift between non-democratic technocratic liberalism and democratic authoritarianism. This is a serious point For most liberal scholars, the dismantling of all those institutions conceived to restrain the demos is precisely what safeguards democracy. For not a few, however, liberal institutions should be grasped precisely as the conservative part or even as a reactionary restriction of the power of the demos. Finally, as against claims that populism does not fit globalization, I argue that it fits perfectly well, using globalization in its favor and growing and thriving under the politics of identities in Western societies. The politics of identities usually are related to the liberal and progressive left desire to be more accommodating to feeble minorities. Populists do not reject the politics of identities, however, they twist their meaning in a full and intelligent manner. They transform the meaning of feeble minority into either a feeble majority or a strong majority that feels as a feeble minority. In this sense, under the strategy that I personally define as multiculturalism of the right, populism shifts the identity debate from the progressive left to the exclusionary right, where I must say it originally belonged. Scholars rightly dispute whether populism is an ideology, a political strategy, or a political language. Yet what all agree upon is that if there is an ideological content, it is rather low. The central feature of populism is precisely its political strategy, which divides society between people and elites. Both concepts, people and elites, as remarked by Ernesto Laclau, are in reality empty signifiers. Different types of populist movements fill up these concepts according to local necessities. In this sense, the idea of who is the pure people and who are the corrupted elites differs according to different contexts. Some scholars remark that the people of populism is represented by a Rousseauian concept of the general will. While that might be true, and the Jacobins in France represented the idea of the general will, still the general will is very much connected with the power of egalitarian institutions, which populists very much disregard. A second version, totally opposed to political institutions that represent liberal democracy, is portrayed by the Latin American model. It could be the examples of Perón and Chavez. The leader represents the people, which he defends against the oligarchical elites, while the central factor of concern is economic distribution rather than the politics of identities. Accent is placed in immediate economic rewards, something that resonates today as much as in the past. Indeed, one of the central factors of populist movements at the economic realm is shortism. Get rid of procedures that block the democratic leader desire to socioeconomic reform. When Evita Perón, for instance, was approached by experts and being told, "My lady, experts claim that your policies imply bread for today and hunger for tomorrow," she would respond fast, "Of course that I know. You think that I'm an idiot. But do what experts say, recommend, and you will suffer hunger today and also tomorrow. So get the check now and don't comply. Be loyal to the leadership to the very end." Regarding identity, this version of populism is not necessarily ethno-minded, and in some cases, it could be at least pluralist. For left populists, diversity in society could be an option as far as we don't talk about cultural or minority rights. Precisely the absence of cultural rights allow a possible coexistence of diverse identities in a populist coalition under a political leader. In short, the leader is the guarantee of diversity. Yet the idea of populism as redistribution may conceal the neoliberal version of populism that grew up with Carlos Menem in Argentina and Fujimori in Peru, and nowadays it has Netanyahu in Israel as one of its greatest exponents, at least until COVID-19. The neoliberal version of populism indeed makes a clear case for the politics of polarization of identities. This type of populism attacks global and international economic institutions, although harder than them, it attacks global human rights organizations, as well as the very idea of universal social welfare, very different from left populism. The idea here is to defend wealthy nationalism that should be identified with clientelism. I reward my clients and I reward them in two packages, part economic and part identity. Both are combined. Indeed, the polarization of identities could be successful because it responds to a new class conflict which hardly has any connection to the old Marxist conflict between proletariat and bourgeoisie. Unprecedented economic progress as a result of free trade and globalization have undoubtedly made the West richer, modern, and more diverse. However, together with it, not only this process was accompanied by increasing inequalities, but in more sense than one, has sowed the seeds of a new social confrontation, which could be defined as a false class struggle. Why? Because it's not one between capitalist and working class, but a class struggle between a new class of hard-working, technocratic elites, urban, general liberal-minded, who are global and open to diversity, and are associated to the most harmed, a poor group of immigrants in the case of Europe, and immigrants and blacks in the case of America, paradoxically and ridiculously included within the camp of the winners. The other side are the losers, composed by the peripheral blue working class, prone to accept a discourse of resentment based in both economic and cultural nationalism. The latter are not necessarily interested in true data. Indeed, college-educated people scoff at Mr. Trump's promises to bring back the factories. The factories are never coming back, they insisted. But even false hope is a form of hope, perhaps the most important one. Finally, while most words have expressed the racist character of this national populism, my own research reaches more ambivalent conclusions. 2 points must be stressed in regard to who the enemy is. Liberal elites, immigrants, foreigners, all of them. Well, in reality, the real fools of populism are liberal elites more than immigrants. Yet even more complicated than that, populists want to strip the Silicon Valley of political and moral power, but they are not necessarily against their economic success. Silicon Valley and alike constitute a necessary punching ball to be punched morally and politically, but without exterminating it. In short, they want to use their economic success in order to reward political clients. In the case of Israel, paying the Haredi population is one of the keys of Netanyahu's staying in power. Regarding race, the question is whether the rejection of immigrants and other cultures imply white supremacy. Are national populists today in this line of thought? In America, undoubtedly, they are. In Europe, the answer is half and half. Populists respect other cultures, but far from Europe. And basically, they reject the idea of assimilation, and despite that several populist movements in Europe pay lip service to that idea, in reality, they come to say that Muslims are not assimilable, and this has an history. Already during the Dreyfus affair, the French writer Maurice Barrès, who was totally anti-Dreyfus, defined the ideal of an ethno-nationalism which is compelling nowadays. For Barrès, only the politics of republican democratic assimilation could transform a Jew into a non-authentic French citizen. But at the end of the day, he was in favor of amnesty for Dreyfus, because people of different species cannot be traitor to the homeland. Only nationals could be a traitor, and Jews are not part of the nation. So let him be free. Nowadays, intellectuals such as Alain de Benoit understood more than any other this claim. French Muslim girls donning the hijab should be respected and excluded. The worst development for de Benoit would be an assimilator or secularized Muslim. The idea of respect and exclusion is part of the dynamic swing of the plea of diversity. Different from the populist left, those of the right need diversity precisely to exclude. Yet the ultimate question is whether both sides, the excluder and the excluded, could share some common interest. And there are some indications. It should be of no surprise that Leopold Seignour, the African outstanding apostle of negritude, was introduced to the philosophy of Maurice Barrès and was deeply influenced by him. The glorification of the value of the ethnic customs and rural life, which contrasted with the impersonality of urban life, was central to Barrès and Seignour. In more sense than one, those examples confirm de Benoit's intuition, which was already manifested by Jean-Paul Sartre when he defined the Third World struggle against Western modernization as un racisme anti-raciste or anti-racist racism. An overview of national populist movement and intellectuals of the new right, from Dugin in Russia to de Benoit in France, René Guénon, and the follower Claudio Muti, an ideologue of the Lega Nord, might help us to understand this strange collaboration. The message to Muslims is, you are not the enemy. We have a common enemy, globalist human rights liberals. You there and me here. Populists in Europe and forward radicals indeed may have a future, separated and together, a multicultural world rather than a multicultural society. In short, no supremacy by separatism. So the question is, what is to be done? And with this I finish. Scholars like Levitsky and Simblad in How Democracies Die have dealt with the question of how democracies undermine themselves precisely because of the loss of common norms and values. Polarization generally triggered by populist movements usually point in that direction. Yet other views, which would sound even more pessimistic to liberals, such as that of Chantal Mouffe, understand that the confrontation between extremes, even if those extremes are minorities, will radicalize the whole political system. The question is whether this will lead to the end of democracy or may lead to an agonizing democracy that refuses to die. That might be a democracy of enemies, which in that case will have to find a minimal coexistence, a minimal consensus for a coexistence. John Rawls conceived the idea for an overlapping consensus between different concepts of the good, especially to address cultural and religious minorities within the nation. The proposal is a minimal sense of citizenship, or if we want, political liberalism, rather than a principled liberalism, should be applied in order to coexist with liberal feeble minorities. Yet the most realistic assessment is that the formula will have to be applied not with feeble cultural or religious minority, but with national populism. That means that liberals in Western societies will have to survive the way they are doing it right now, with their conceptual and political enemies side by side. Liberals are not going to run anyway and will stick to their moral ideas to the very end. Populists will hardly run away and even radicalize, because the ABC of the populist sense of politics is going to the base. Never run away of your more direct clients. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. These were really rich and incisive papers, and I see my role as just opening the conversation. So what I'm going to do is try to put the papers in dialogue with one another, highlight what I see as points of intersection and divergence, because I think there may be slightly different, each of the papers may have offered a slightly different analysis of our current political moment. And I'll pose some questions to each of the authors, again, in an effort to open up the conversation. So I'll start with Rogers. And I'm persuaded that we are witnessing a paradigm shift of some kind in terms of the dominant racial policy alliances or coalitions that are shaping the discourse in America. And I found it a very persuasive analysis. But I guess I wanted to ask you two questions. One, which perhaps will involve an element of prediction, and I imagine you're going to try to resist being pushed to make any sorts of predictions or prophecies or generalizations about the future. But I guess I wondered, in your presentation, I sensed that you think that Trumpism has basically captured the Republican Party, and that what you call the systematic racism and reparations frame has, if not captured the Democratic Party, it has at least become, or is on the way to becoming, the hegemonic discourse about race and racism amongst liberals and progressives. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, do you really think, first of all, as I suppose it's an empirical question, do you really think that as an empirical matter, it is the case that white protectionism has captured the entire Republican Party, such that even if Trump loses next week, we won't see a return to color blindness or to more traditional forms of conservatism, but we'll see this emphasis on white perfectionism continued going forward. And on the Democratic or progressive side of the ledger, I mean, certainly one of the most striking things about the response to the killing of George Floyd was the rapid shift in public opinion and radicalization of public opinion, especially white public opinion, with respect to race relations. But my understanding is, and I'm not an expert on American politics, I'm just an American who reads the newspaper, but my understanding is that the poll numbers tracking white support for Black Lives Matters actually have gone down slightly recently. But it's also the case, for example, that one interpretation of why Joe Biden became the Democratic nominee was because liberals and progressives, including large numbers of African Americans, found his more traditional articulation of Democratic themes, including those with respect to race and racism, either more resonant or more strategically, they had more confidence in the strategic efficacy of the language that he spoke, as opposed to the more radical language spoken by Bernie Sanders and others. So that leads me to my second question, which is, I took from your remarks that you think that the embrace of the systematic racism and reparations framing may be a strategic mistake. And so I guess that's my question. Do you think it's a strategic mistake? Do you think there's perhaps even substantively that language is not a justified or powerful language? Is it a mistake to embrace, for liberals and progressives to embrace this language? Okay, so I want to now try to put Alan and Ying's paper in dialogue, which I think at first glance, it appears that you're all working in a somewhat similar theoretical framework, because Alan and Ying are talking about, first of all, they talk about protectionism, right? One of the policy conclusions that they reach at the end of their analysis is a defense of certain kinds of cultural protectionism in the relations between countries, although of course the ethical impulse behind their protectionism is very different from that of the ethical impulse animating Trump's white protectionism. But you are talking about cultural exchange, both in the ethical sense, but also in the very concrete sense of which TV shows are shown on Netflix around the world and what should our trade policies be. And so there is something structural about that analysis, which looks at culture not just as a set of symbolic forms, but the material consequences of cultural exchange. And I take it that you are arguing for a restructuring of the material relations surrounding culture. But on further inspection, I think that you still are working with a slightly different theoretical frame, which may have echoes of the racial policy alliance that, according to Rogers, prevailed in the United States starting in the 1970s. And that was the opposition between the colorblind versus color conscious racial policy alliance, because it seems to me, if I understood correctly, that one of the reasons why you're interested in culture is precisely because culture is a source of stereotypes and then hopefully a source of re-education that could allow us to overcome negative stereotypes. And so I was struck by the fixation on stereotypes which result from insufficient cultural sophistication, and therefore the hope that through more just relations of cultural exchange, we could overcome stereotypes, that stereotypes are on some level about personal attitudes, right? On some level, you are interested in the personal attitudes that are created by cultural production and consumption. And I think that emphasis on personal attitudes in some ways does come from the era of the colorblind versus color conscious debates, because one of the aims of those debates was precisely to identify problematic personal attitudes and overcome them, rather than focusing on impersonal structures, which I think is one of the changes in the American discourse, is precisely the turn away from a focus on personal attitudes and opinions towards impersonal structures that, regardless of the intentions of those who operate with them, nevertheless perpetuate forms of racial inequality. So the first question that I wanted to ask you is whether you think that the structural racism frame is applicable in the international context. Is that frame applicable in the context of the modes of global cultural exchange that you're interested in? And what one might think that it is, precisely because some of the most pernicious legacies of colonialism are material, right? They're not just attitudinal, but they're also economic and material. And then the second question I wanted to ask you was about, because I think that your paper involves a tacit, or maybe it's explicit, I'm not sure, a theory about what culture does, or what is the political function of culture. And I'd be interested to hear more about that. And I was struck by the fact that when you gave the presentation today, you spoke about the political promise that you're locating in culture seems to stem more from the ability of culture to express an abstract capacity for agency, as opposed to anything tied to the content of culture, right? That mutual respect is supposed to come from the demonstration of abstract agency, regardless of what the content of that culture was. And so I was wondering, is this conception of the political function of culture perhaps too abstract, precisely because all you're asking for is the evidence of agential capacity, which seems like a pretty low bar. And I also wondered, perhaps on a more pragmatic level, is there a difference between high culture versus low culture? Sort of in terms of your pragmatic policy recommendations, is the idea just that those of us who live in the periphery should, flood Netflix with our TV shows, and that will bring about the desired transformation in the moral standing of non-European peoples? Okay, moving on, because I'm trying to be conscious of time. Yuli, I think in some ways your paper and Alberto's paper are in very close dialogue with one another. And I want to pose two questions to you, which are linked to your diagnosis of the current moment, as one in which a rise in a more national orientation, if I take it correctly, should lead to a greater interest in the social welfare of citizens and perhaps more just forms of social welfare policy. And I agree with you that one of the most striking aspects of the response to the pandemic is that while the pandemic is a global phenomenon by definition that affects every single country and individual living on the planet, the response to the pandemic, at least in its initial stages, and unfortunately I think we're still in the middle, if not at the beginning, involved decisions being taken on a national rather than a global or international level. But I take it that to a certain extent, you see, for example, the immediate closure of borders as the harbinger of, or as a symptom of an intense concern with the lives and welfare of citizens, right? That countries close borders precisely to protect their citizens. But I wonder, and this is my first question, whether these emphatically national responses to the pandemic actually guaranteed or even encouraged a successful handling of the crisis, whether they actually encouraged a protection of citizens. And again, the two cases that I'm most familiar with, which I think both give us reasons for skepticism on this account, are the US and Israel, right? I mean, Israel was one of the countries that in the early stages of the pandemic took a very conservative stance, immediately closed the borders, and the borders are still basically closed to non-citizens. But at this point, we can now say that our handling of the pandemic has been one of the most disastrous handlings of the pandemic on the planet. And similarly, in the United States, while the borders have not been as hermetically sealed as the Israeli border, certainly the rhetoric of Trump's response to the pandemic is a national one, but the American response to the pandemic is equally, if not more catastrophic than the Israeli response. And that leads me to my second question, which is, I think, a more theoretical question, which is that, again, I think you're implying that national equates, if not with social democratic policy positions, nevertheless, it still equates with an increased emphasis on social welfare, care for the worker, redistribution, and policies that perhaps have fallen by the wayside in a globalizing or neoliberal moment. But here, I'm going to invoke Alberto and bring Alberto into the conversation, because I think one of the interesting points that Alberto made was that if we look at the Israeli case and take Bibi Netanyahu as an instance of the fairly successful deployment of many of the tropes of populist rhetoric, it's striking that he is a strong advocate of neoliberal economic policies, right? So if we accept Alberto's characterization of Bibi as a political figure, which I think there is a lot to be said for it, then I think that, again, there's a theoretical but also empirical question being raised, whether taking a more national orientation of the kind that you're advocating necessarily leads to the kind of social welfare policies that you also seem to be advocating. Because again, if we look at if we bring the United States back into the conversation, it's certainly the case that the nationalist rhetoric of the Trump administration has not translated into increased support for healthcare amongst Republicans, for example. So there's a difference between the discourse and the actual policies. So putting you in dialogue with Alberto, I want to ask you to defend the tight linkage that you made between a nationalist political discourse and increased support for social welfare policies, especially with respect to workers and the middle class. Finally, coming to Alberto, I actually think that in addition to speaking to Yuli, your paper also spoke to Rogers and Allen and Ying in interesting ways, because with respect to Rogers' paper, I think you share some of his diagnosis of Trumpism as a form of white identity politics. Rogers, you didn't exactly use that language, right? Use the language of protectionism, which might be different. I don't know. I'd be interested to hear. But I think you are sharing you offered similar diagnoses of Trumpism as a form of white identity politics, and I think there's a lot to be said for that diagnosis. And I think, Alberto, that your paper also spoke to Allen and Ying in an interesting way, because if I understood correctly, the arguments we were making at the end about separatism without supremacy, I took you to be saying in part that white populists are not interested in cultural imperialism anymore, right? They're not interested in cultural imperialism. So if Allen and Ying are trying to convince us that cultural imperialism is a form of material injustice that we need to work against, if Alberto's empirical sociological diagnosis is correct, that populists have lost any interest in cultural imperialism, I don't know if that means that your policy recommendations are, or maybe that if populism continues to thrive, perhaps we should worry less about cultural imperialism. I don't know, but that would be an interesting conversation between the two of you. And then questions that I wanted to ask Alberto. On the one hand, I think you do take the populist self-representation too much at face value to a certain extent. So when you say that populism has a strong social base, I do worry that you're perhaps naively accepting the populist self-representation that when they rail against the elites, the people who they call elites actually are elites. And here again, I would invoke the Israeli case and Netanyahu's rhetoric, since at this point, he rails against the elites and uses that rhetoric to try to rouse his base. But if we look at who has been in power in Israel for the past 20 plus years, it is him, right? So I do think that perhaps a more effective political response or strategic response to that kind of discourse would be to challenge the very notion of what counts as an elite, right? Who counts as an elite? And if you have been the longest serving prime minister, surpassing Ben-Gurion, perhaps you can't accuse professors of being an elite because you're the ones who really have the power. But having said that on the one hand, I think you give too much credit to the self-representation of populists. On the other hand, I wanted to take a step back and think, well, maybe since, as you correctly note, populists wage their campaign in the name of democracy, right? They don't reject democracy. They claim that we are the proper instantiation of democracy. Is there something to be said for their critique of democracy? And on that score, I was struck by the fact that you basically frame the debate or contest about democracy as one between liberals and populists. But certainly the spectrum of democratic thought is not exhausted by those two positions, right? There are other positions on the democratic plane, including forms of radical democracy, for example. So I wonder whether in framing the current political debate as one between liberals and populists, you perhaps unwittingly mute other voices that would perhaps offer a more powerful opposition to the populist interpretation of democracy that could perhaps take on board some of the populist critiques without falling into the familiar traps that the liberal interpretation of democracy has fallen into, and perhaps legitimately has become a less compelling interpretation of democracy for many people around the world. So with that, I will conclude and open the floor to questions from the audience. Do you guys want to respond? Ronen, what?
Please,
Yeah,
Rogers has to leave, so
Okay.
I believe that Rogers should be answering first.
Okay, please.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I do have to leave in about 10 minutes. Those are amazing comments on the fly, Julie, that raised so many excellent questions. Just to respond to the ones that you raised to me, I do think that the Republican Party is going to be the party of Trump, at least for one or two more election cycles, because of his success, even if he gets defeated. And I think that the protectionist message will remain prominent with the qualifier that when it comes to courtrooms, I think racial conservatives will continue to emphasize colorblindness. They don't have a legal language for white protectionism. But in political discourse, the protectionist rhetoric, I think, will be the dominant Republican rhetoric. I do see it as a form of white identity politics, but the presentation matters, and the emphasis on protectionism, I think, is important to understand the appeal of the phenomenon. In terms of the Democrats, I think you have it right that I see the systemic racism reparations perspective as on the rise and with a good chance of prevailing in the Democratic Party. It's not there yet, but I will note that in this campaign, Joe Biden is using the phrase systemic racism. Yeah. He's criticizing Republicans for not recognizing systemic racism, and he supported the bill to create a reparations commission. Do I see this as a strategic mistake? I do see it as a strategic risk. I used to think it was a mistake. Now there's been enough receptivity that I'm beginning to reconsider, but I do think it is challenging. I mean, I do believe America suffers from systemic racism. It's a question of whether that kind of language is politically potent or not. I think it's essential to detach reparations from any kind of legal calculus of an exact amount owed by X to Y, because you can't present that in a credible way. You have to present reparations as part of an investment in overcoming the broader mistakes of the past through a wide range of policies. And if those policies are presented in ways that make them appear broadly beneficial to Americans, not simply to different groups of people of color, then I think it has a chance to be a politically successful strategy, but it will be challenging to do that.
Great. Since Rogers has to go, should we take a few questions from the audience for Rogers, and then we can invite the other panelists to respond? Ronan, how do people raise their hand?
I think that people can ask. We have like 5 minutes, I think, in total, 5 to 8 minutes to get some questions to everyone, I guess.
Okay, so why don't we collect 2 or 3 questions?
Yeah. So I guess that if anyone has a question, please raise your hand or simply mention that in the chat or something like that.
Michael.
Yeah. First off, for the paper on cultural protection, for Ms. Chen and Professor Patten, when I read the Macaulay quote, it's hard for me to get away from the question of whether Macaulay is right or not about the relative value of these things for historical understanding. I've never read the Indian sources to which he referred, but I spent a fair amount of time once reading ancient Chinese historical sources in translation. And while you learn something about them from China, I think that Macaulay might have had a point if you compared them to Herodotus or Thucydides or Polybius or the Bible, Western books, historical books of equally ancient vintage or more ancient vintage. What makes the greater contribution to historical understanding? So when you present a quote like that, I assume that as all right thinking people are supposed to say that this is obviously false. And so I wonder if you've made the experiment that Macaulay calls for to see if it's false. And if not, why is that experiment irrelevant that Macaulay calls for? For Professor Smith, I'm kind of stuck with Kaufman's white shift, a much more complicated understanding of race and of whiteness than you seem to presume. I'm a little puzzled in the American context by how Blackness in America somehow incorporates both people whose personal stories have a lot to do with the legacy of slavery in America and people like Senator Harris or Barack Obama, who have sort of taken on that story as their own, even though their personal histories are very different and not any more closely linked to that of American slavery than that of, say, Japanese American immigrants. So I'm a little puzzled about how these coalitions actually work in practice, whether they'll continue to work, whether we shouldn't be surprised that, in fact, the shift away from colorblind policies hasn't, after 1965, hasn't actually benefited the descendants of American slaves nearly to the extent that it's benefited the Barack Obamas and the Kamala Harrises, and how all this is going to play out in terms of practical politics.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I see we have a question from Shmuel Yerushalmi. Why don't we take your question now, and then we'll ask the panelists to respond.
Okay, I hear. Okay, I want, my name is Shmuel Yerushalmi, and I want to ask a question about the connection between racism to interest of capitalist system in racism, in hatred, and in dividing between people. This is my question.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we have Rogers and then Alan and Ying?
Well, in response to Michael, I think you make some good points. The one reason I've been skeptical about the reparations language is precisely because it implies a debt to people who come, in fact, from a diversity of backgrounds who didn't experience either slavery or the modern injuries of Jim Crow, more modern injuries of Jim Crow segregation. And that's why I think it's risky to move in those directions. At the same time, if reparations are cast less as a precise payback to specific people who were injured, and instead as the kind of programs that can be seen as investments in disadvantaged communities in the population in ways that ultimately benefit all, they might be more politically palatable. But you're right that the affirmative action kinds of initiatives didn't reach the most disadvantaged Americans. From that standpoint, the focus on systemic racism actually is encouraging policies that might reach more of those disadvantaged Americans than the former agenda of race-conscious policies did. And again, if so, it might prove more politically effective. And thank you all. I am going to have to go now. It's been terrific to participate, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's been great having you. Alan and Ying.
Maybe I'll say something quickly in response to the two questions that were just asked, and then if Ying wants to say anything about Julie's comments, she can add that. But just briefly on Michael's question, I guess our main point was not whether or not Macaulay was right or not in what he says. I'm sure we have opinions about that, but rather that he's an example of the tendency to form judgments about the appropriateness of regarding someone as a social equal or a group as social equals on the basis of an evaluation of their cultural output. And he was quite a, I think he was a powerful example of that tendency. So that's the key point that we were trying to make with the reference to Macaulay. The other question asked about the role of capitalism in thinking about racism, and I actually just wanted to connect that up with the point that Julie raised about connections between Alberto's sort of vision of the right-wing populist vision that he describes of a kind of world of separate but equal peoples, right? That leave one another alone. And I think that is kind of an egalitarian. There's a kind of egalitarian character to that vision. But I would think that populist view would therefore have to wrestle with some of the concerns that Ying and I are talking about because of the tendency, I think, of under capitalism for producers of mass culture to produce forms of culture and to exchange culture in ways that I think undermine the egalitarian relations that are being presupposed there. So I think that maybe points to a tension in the populist view. Ying, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks. I'll respond to, I think, two of really, really great questions that Julie raised. The first one, I think, is broadly about whether a focus on structural racism can also be applicable in this case that we're discussing. Why are we focusing so much on personal attitudes? And I think that, it is I guess we do stress individual dispositions, but I think the thought is that in order to have the kind of structural changes that we're interested in to global communications, so for example, in order for citizens to pressurize their governments to support trade agreements in which cultural sectors are not asked to liberalize, for example. So in order for these kinds of policy changes to happen, people's attitudes ultimately matter a lot. And this is why we stress that even though social equality requires material changes, ultimately it is a matter, the prior step is whether individuals are able to recognize other people as moral equals deserving of they're sort of, advocating for change or supporting change, structural change on behalf of those other groups. And so that's why I think there's not a huge tension between emphasizing the strategies to combat attitudes and structural, the kinds of things that would be required to change structural racism. And then the other question, which is also really important, is this, question about the political import of cultural production, by emphasizing that, all we need is cultural goods that demonstrate that there's evidence of agency. It seems like we're not taking into account the fact that content could still be problematic, even if produced by people of marginalized groups. And I think this is a really, really important point. I think our point, though, is that evidence of agency is necessary, but not always sufficient for social equality. Nonetheless, I think it would be bad if all of the cultural content that was progressive was produced by a certain dominant group. And instead of allowing marginalized groups to also be able to contribute and demonstrate that they also have these capacities to produce progressive content. And so I guess the idea is that cultural producers might have a moral obligation to not produce content that's problematic or reproduces stereotypes. But nonetheless, as a matter of policy, I don't think that it's appropriate to kind of for the state to pick and choose different kinds of content to support based on how well they do for social equality. But I think the main point that we want to emphasize is that it's not enough for content to be unproblematic. It's also important who gets to produce that content. And that's because of this long history in which people who are seen as not having that capacity are racialized in problematic ways. Thanks.
Great. So as you can see outside my window, night has already fallen in Tel Aviv. And so we're coming towards the end. So I'd like to offer first Yuli and then Alberto a chance to respond and speak, and then we will conclude. Yuli.
Thank you for really amazing way of sort of pulling everything together and asking great questions. Well, I think first of all, the first question, was it wise to act nationally? No. And this is why it's so interesting that everybody did. Actually, the most, probably the most effective way was to cut North Italy from South Italy and protect the South. But no country was able to do it. And you see what happens to us in Israel. We know we should cut the country into regions, but it doesn't work because there is a national policy. So the fact that it wasn't the logical thing to do, but instinctively that's what people do. This is why I'm saying that it re-emphasizes the national instincts that I, as you know, think are there and in time of crisis appear. Now, whether nationalism is naturally connected to welfarism, historically the nation state brought a welfare state. I mean, there was a historical connection, but nationalism can go in many directions. I think now the question is not about welfarism. First of all, the first question is about the state coming back as an active player. And then the question will be raised, what is the state doing? And you're right, there are people like Trump and Bibi would say, I'll send you a check, I will not create a social institution. And there will be people who say, yes, I will create a public institution to answer the need. And here you'll see the sort of division between the more welfare and individualistic understanding of how to support people. So we have crossed, or as you rightly said, we changed the paradigm. It's not anymore the invisible hand, it's a state. Now we ask the right question from my point of view, what should the state do? And therefore, I think the dialogue is being transformed. And you see it, I think, in Israel very clearly. Bibi is a neoliberal, but he's now offering things he would never have offered before to the people and to the, speaking about workers became the most popular term for fascist, for populist, for liberals. Everybody wants to save the workers. So now it seems sort of natural, but it isn't. So the new terminology now offers, I think, in my view, a chance to create a new political discourse. And people are pushed into this discourse because this is what the public demands. I think that's where I think there is a change of a paradigm. I know a lot of people think that extremism is going to be the order of the day in the near future. I actually think the people, and the people in the street in Tel Aviv, the people in the street that are marching with Black Lives Matter, the people in other parts of the world who are both marching with the Israeli flag and then saying, go home, no corruption, social justice. They are the new national left that hasn't been here for a long, long time. And I think the national sort of left in the sense of welfare, caring, and so on, is going to reemerge. It's now happening in India against Modi. It's happening elsewhere. It's those people who bump all these statues and said, it's our history, and we want it to be fair, just, pay compensation. It's a new merger that is, I think, creating something interesting.
Great. Alberto, it's appropriate that you have the last word, since it is just thanks to you that we are all here today.
But you're right. Society is much more complex. It's not binary, absolutely not. But that's the work of populism, the idea of creating that binary. So when we talk about politics, it works or it doesn't work. It's simple as that. I mean, if people are identified by a concept that the populist leader promotes, then we have political reality. Then, okay, we are scholars. We can deconstruct. We can talk one to each other. Just explain how badly that is. But political reality becomes a political reality if it works. You know, even this Barres used to say when there was a debate about whether France could be considered a race, he would say that's stupid. France is not a race, but racism is what politics is about. In other words, what he was saying actually is that you create a myth, and if it works, and it generally works, then it's political. Then you are there. So when the only thing that you can divide is that, you know, liberals, socialists, Greens, whoever, the people in the streets in Tel Aviv are part of what I would say, the Enlightenment Party, the party of the Enlightenment. People that understand reason, that can discuss, people that can be more left and right. That's that kind of party. The other party, the party of the populists, what we would call them shame at you, well, nonsense. They are not shamed. They're not shamed. When we call them shame at you, they're not shamed. It's actually, they feel strengthened by that. I mean, that's the other construction that populists can promote. And populist leaders come from the elite generally. Don't think about the working class. They come from the elite. They always come from the elite. Chavez was from the elite. Perón was from the elite. Netanyahu was from the elite. Salvini is from the elite too. So in basic terms, is a way of doing politics, no ideology, way of doing politics. And it's becoming part of the political debate. Simple as that. So we as students of political science, whatever we can say is that we have to consider that situation as it is.
Great, thanks so much. Special thanks, Alan, Yuli, Ying, for your really provocative contributions, and Alberto for both the provocative contribution and also for your organizing efforts and hospitality. And it's been a great opening to the year. I hope that we'll continue the conversation throughout the semester on Zoom and, God willing, perhaps in person. And on that note, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. And
thank you.
Let's continue the conversation.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Ranen. Thank you, Yuli. All of you. Thank you very much.